Once upon a time, around 1930, 31 or so, a professor at Oxford University sat down to grade some examination papers. The exact date is still the subject of debate. On one of the sheets, the exact location where, the reverse side or a margin, is also debatable. On a whim, he wrote 10 simple words. He could not have dreamt that those innocent words would eventually spawn an international multi-billion-dollar industry. The professor, of course, was John Ronald Reuel Tolkien. And those 10 words formed one of the most famous opening lines in all of English literature. In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit. Right up there with Call Me Ishmael, It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Marley was dead to begin with. And of course, it was a dark and stormy night. I have spent most of the past year tromping through the war-ravaged lands of Middle-earth, trying to explain things to people who didn't seem to want to understand. So, after a little R&R, dealing with something as trivial as World War II, I'm ready to return to the Shire and surrounds with an examination of The Hobbit. Now, as stated in the description, this will be part review, part reaction, part book versus movie comparison, and part general commentary. And a rant or two just to round things out. And maybe a few points where The Hobbit links with the Lord of the Rings. And one more thing. We'll be viewing the theatrical versions, mainly because that's what I have. I've tried to find extended versions, haven't had much luck. And what I have found is outrageously expensive. So sign your contracts, grab your walking sticks and pocket handkerchiefs, and let's get going. The Lord of the Rings was produced by Warner Brothers through its subsidiary New Line Cinema. By the time The Hobbit came along, New Line was totally absorbed by Warner, but still operated under its own name. Understanding movie studio ownership and management is not for the faint of heart. For some reason, MGM got involved in this as well, which may have led to a few questionable decisions that we'll touch on later.
It began long ago.
The first 8 minutes are actually revealed to Bilbo in bits and pieces throughout the story, rather than in one big introduction.
There was the city of Dale, its markets known far and wide. For this city lay before the doors of the greatest kingdom in Middle-earth, Erebor. For his line lay secure in the lives of his son and grandson. The skill of the dwarves was unequaled, fashioning objects of great beauty. the heart of the mountain, the Arkenstone.
Call out the guard. Do it now!
What is it?
Dragon! Dragon!
For dragons covered gold with a dark and fierce desire. Erebor was lost. Thranduil would not
The background of the
survive
dwarves
the
is
kill against
helpful.
The wrath of the dragon.
Too bad
No
Jackson
help came
didn't give
from
the
the
viewer
elves
that
back.
kind of history of the elves in Lord of the Rings. It would have made the movie much easier to understand.
Robbed of their homeland, the dwarves of Erebor wandered the wilderness. In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit.
Only the first 2 sentences of the book are included, followed by a slight paraphrase, and that followed by some descriptions of Bilbo's home, which were obvious enough without any
This
verbalization.
was a hobbit hole, and that means had all the comforts of home.
Frodo, obviously, was not in the book, but his extended cameo here was sort of necessary. Since the 2 trilogies, a totally inaccurate word, which I'll use just for convenience, were filmed in reverse order, it seems some sort of bridge would be needed to connect the 2 stories, which Frodo provided.
What on earth are these?
Replies to the party invitations.
Good gracious. Is it today? Lobelia, Sackville Baggins. She had all my spoons stuffed in her pocket. Dreadful woman.
And the bit about Lobelia and the spoons was briefly touched on in the Fellowship of the Ring, the book only. Tolkien unnecessarily introduces us to Bilbo's mother, the former Belladonna Took. She's only mentioned once more by Gandalf in the next scene. But if you're interested in Bilbo's family, check the links above and below.
And nothing unexpected ever happened.
Now, the book chapter was an unexpected party. Now, remember, the Lord of the Rings started with a long expected party.
All of them at once, I suppose.
Gandalf's visit was much the same, discussing what good morning meant.
That I should have lived to be good morning by Belladonna Took's son, as if I were selling buttons at the door.
Not Gandalf, the wandering wizard who made such excellent fireworks.
Old Took used to have them on Midsummer's Eve.
But Bilbo included more of Gandalf's resume beyond just the fireworks. And Bilbo very specifically invited Gandalf for tea the next day. Now, if the hobbits were like the British, and throughout both sagas they were portrayed as if they were, tea would have been mid-morning or mid-afternoon, not well into the evening as shown here. Picky, I know, but Peter Jackson just cannot bring himself to leave the original alone. He always has to muck about with it. Now, I guess he wanted to make the dwarf business darker, figuratively, so why not literally as well? The dwarves enter in similar fashion, with a few minor changes. There is Dwalin, then Balin, then Feely and Keely. Then to prove even Tolkien isn't perfect, he says there are 4 more coming, then proceeds to introduce 5 of them. Dori, Nori, Ori, Oin, and Gloin. And another group of 4, Bifur, Bofur, Bombur, quote, and especially Thorin, unquote. He didn't dramatically show up fashionably late. There are a number of interesting facts about dwarves that should be mentioned at this point. First is the name. Now, in 20th century English, the plural of dwarf is dwarfs. Of course, in the 21st century, the term isn't used at all, being replaced by the politically correct little people. Tolkien says the reason for this can be found in The Lord of the Rings. Well, Appendix F does make mention, but offers no real explanation. So, we're stuck with it. Secondly, Tolkien's dwarves are not the same as Jackson's dwarves. Now, at this point, they're much closer to Snow White's dwarfs, with their brightly colored hoods and the silly chip the glasses, crack the plates song. The song is in the book, just not with the Barnum and Bailey choreography. Although they do grow as the story progresses, the dwarves never quite have the distinct personalities that Jackson gives them. But their table manners never mature. This is a good time to remind everyone that The Lord of the Rings is an epic saga of the eternal struggle between good and evil, while The Hobbit is a simple children's story, a fairy tale, if you will. They may take place in the same universe, but they are not the same, they're not equal in depth, and were never intended to be. By Tolkien, at any rate. Who knows what Jackson had in mind? You can't, and shouldn't, compare the two, books or movies, any more than you can compare a grapefruit to a tangerine. They're related, yes, but one is large and bitter, and the other is small and sweet. The rest of the chapter is backwards. The book presents the Misty Mountains Cold song much earlier, before the discussion about the journey.
Detective, do we sit back while others claim what is rightfully ours? Or do we seize this chance to take back Erebor?
These runes speak of a hidden passage to the lower halls.
There's another way in.
And berating Bilbo's abilities.
He looks more like a grocer than a burglar.
Aye, the wild is no place for gentle folk who can neither fight nor fend for themselves.
As usual in these situations, the topics covered are the same, but the details of the dialogue are quite different. The book, as always, gives much more backstory. And the story about how golf was invented is in both versions.
Swung his club so hard, it knocked the Goblin King's head clean off, and it sailed 100 yards through the air and went down a rabbit hole.
But at a slightly different time and under different circumstances. Eventually, the movie gets around to the song. Many people don't realize Tolkien began his literary career as a poet, long before he began writing prose. And he never stopped. Now that's why there's so many songs and poems in the books. The dwarves only sang 2 of the 10 verses. Beautiful though it may be, most of the audience would fall asleep if it went on any longer. Our 15 adventurers did.
Far over the misty mountains cold.
The morning came. Bilbo arose and saw, quote, all the signs of a large and hurried breakfast. There was a fearful mess in the room, and piles of unwashed crocks in the kitchen, unquote. I don't see any of that, do you? Gandalf walked in and directed Bilbo to a piece of paper on the mantelpiece. The contract. Speaking too fast for the Hobbit to reply, he prodded Bilbo out the door. Bilbo ran as fast as he could down the lane, and then for a mile more. He arrived at the Green Dragon, as he was instructed, just as the dwarves were getting ready to set out. And gracious, he realized he had forgotten his hat, his walking stick, his money, and his pocket handkerchief.
Stop! We have to turn around.
What on earth is the matter?
I've forgotten my handkerchief.
Before long, Gandalf rode up, bringing the items that Bilbo had forgotten, along with a pipe and tobacco.
Oh, they took wagers on whether or not you'd turn up. Most of them bet that you wouldn't.
And what did you think?
I never doubted you for a second.
There were no wagers.
You would have to manage without pocket handkerchiefs and a good many other things, Bilbo Baggins, before we reach our journey's end.
Actually, Dwalin said that about 3 pages ago. Gandalf had vanished by this time. More irresistible New Zealand scenery. Now, from here to the end of book chapter 2, the book and the movies are on different planets. I'll relate the story from the book, and I'll illustrate, if possible, from the movie. Although what scenes there are will be seriously out of order. The next day it began to rain, as it will in about 7 minutes of the movie. The company's spirits were, shall we say, drenched. Now, the entire encampment scene is movie only. The story Balin tells was mainly taken from Appendix A of The Lord of the Rings, with the inevitable Jacksonian additions. The big battle was not mentioned at all. You know, by now, you should realize that Jackson must, absolutely must, have battle scenes every now and then, whether they belong or not. A brief mention of it was made back at Bilbo's. Azog's name was mentioned and cursed, but that was about all. At least we are informed of where Thorin's epithet, Oakenshield, came from.
Armor rent, wielding nothing but an oaken branch as a shield.
Jackson isn't usually so generous with information. See? Rain, 7 minutes later. There was no Radagast in the book, and barely any mention of him in The Lord of the Rings. You have to go to Unfinished Tales, and that's the second posthumous book after the Silmarillion, to find more than a sentence or two about him. What a strange little man, or wizard. I will, however, tip my hat to the Roscabel Rabbits, a creation of Jackson's that would almost feel at home in the fairy tale world of the book. In the movie, which is trying to be serious and epic, they're just ridiculous. Eventually, we get to the troll scene. But as usual, we get there from a totally different direction. The rain continued. One of the ponies, quote, took fright at nothing and bolted, unquote. He fell into the river. Keely and Feely were nearly drowned, and all the baggage was washed away. Baggage which included the food. Again, no encampment scene. And they spotted a red glow in the distance. They decided it was a fire. And fire meant people. And people meant food. They headed towards it, quote, with all due and proper caution, unquote. We can now rejoin the movie. Sort of. The trolls didn't steal the horses. Bilbo was not sneezed on. The rest was close enough, except Bilbo did not employ delaying tactics.
The secret to cooking dwarf is,
Yes? Come on.
It's,
Gandalf did. From out of sight, he imitated each of the trolls' voices, instigating a fight between them. Then the sunlight came over the hill without Gandalf splitting the rock, but supplying Bilbo with a story to tell the children at his birthday party 60 years later.
Turn them all to stone.
No thanks to your burglar.
He had the nous to play for time.
He had the what? The nous? Yeah, although it's totally irrelevant to the story, yeah, that is an interesting word. I think I'll discuss it in a sidebar. Or the corner bar, if you prefer. The OED, the Definitive English Language Dictionary, says it's pronounced noose, like a hangman's knot, with two meanings. One is informal, meaning common sense or practical intelligence, as used here. And the other being philosophical, meaning mind or intellect. Of course, everything Oxford has to have a Cambridge counterpart. And the Cambridge Dictionary says nous, and defines it as informal British, meaning good judgment or a practical ability. That's close enough. Merriam-Webster, probably the closest thing to a definitive American English dictionary, has two entries. Nous, with nous being acceptable, meaning mind or reason, in the philosophical sense, or nous, as chiefly British, meaning common sense or alertness. But the word is French, and they don't actually use it in everyday speech anymore. So, who really knows? And of course, this scene is only in the movie. So I suppose it depends on what the New Zealand pronunciation would be. If it was in the book, we could be sure it would have been the OED pronunciation, given Tolkien's association with the university and the dictionary. He worked there when he was younger. Gandalf found the cave without Thorin's suggestion. The finding of the swords was pretty much as described, except the sword that would become Sting was barely mentioned, just as a knife Bilbo picked up, and no philosophy from Gandalf. But the next chapter awaited. Well, we've made a good start. The first 2 chapters of the book, and roughly the first hour of the movie. 17 chapters and 7 hours to go. Thanks for watching. Subscribe so you'll know when the next episode drops. And buy me a coffee if you appreciate what I'm doing.